As you can see all around me today, we also celebrate what many across the world have described as miraculous, a prosperous and thriving post-independent Singapore. Tomorrow is our 56th National Day, but because of the current pandemic, for the first time ever, we'll be postponing our celebrations to 21st August. Now, I love National Day because it is beautiful to stand united with your fellow countrymen. And there is nothing more beautiful than being in one voice and spirit and expressing your love for your country. However, 6 years ago, there was another first. Just 5 days before I was supposed to leave Singapore for another country as a missionary, breaking news broke my heart. Our founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, had left Singapore for another world. On 23rd of March 2015, in the early hours of the morning, Mr. Lee passed away at the age of 91. The inevitable that was unimaginable had happened. And his death prompted a week-long period of mourning, and Singapore almost came to a standstill to remember the man who believed in the notion of Singapore as a republic and gave his life to realizing and defending that. Foreign dignitaries flew in from all over the world to pay their last respects. By the end of it, 1.2 million people had paid their respects to Mr. Lee. So on 29th of March 2015, after spending my very first night away from home on a permanent basis, my appreciation for Mr. Lee and Singapore couldn't have been more profound. And I turned on the television to watch the live telecast of Mr. Lee's final journey in a gun carriage from Parliament House to the funeral at the University Cultural Centre at NUS. And more than 100,000 Singaporeans lined the streets and stood their ground even when heavy rain threatened to disperse them. PM Lee would later go on to say, "I was deeply moved to see the crowd stand their ground, paying their last respects to Mr. Lee. Teardrops and raindrops fell together." And so did mine as I was watching that. Every Singaporean knew Mr. Lee's passing was coming, but when it finally happened, none of us wished it did. Death has a 100% track record, and no matter how much we try to prevent it, the inevitable always happens. A part of us sometimes feel like it has died along with the person whom we buried or cremated. And in the last 10 days, within a space of 4 days, I attended 2 funerals of church members. And I'm so sorry for their loss. Yet I'm heartened to see the faith and hope of their surviving family members despite the great pain the enemy, death, had clearly caused in their lives. And to escape the destructive nature of death, all throughout human history, across every race, civilization, people have been trying to find the solution to death unsuccessfully. Everyone wants, but no one has ever found that elusive elixir of life, right? Actually, no. It's just that people throughout history have been searching in the wrong places. Life has always been in plain sight for all to see. Creation just cannot possibly search amongst the created to try and find the creator. Instead of looking to an alchemist who claims to be able to conjure life, people should look to the Almighty who creates life. So today, we will look at Jesus' final recorded miracle at Bethany, where he raised Lazarus from the dead. It tells us how we can indeed cross over from death to life. And once again, I will share with you 3 revelations through it. And the first one is this: divine appointment revealed. Now, the account of raising Lazarus from the dead is a pretty long one. So we'll split up into 3 parts for today. And for the first part, obviously, we will start at the beginning, and we'll read from John chapter 11, verses 1 to 17. And it says this: "Now, a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus and said, 'Lord, the one you love is ill.' And when he heard this, Jesus said, 'This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back." Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." And his disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Now, Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them very plainly, "Guys, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But come, let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." And on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus were siblings whom Jesus was close to. They loved and were loved by Jesus. And not too long ago, they had just hosted Jesus at their house, where Martha was distracted by all the preparations she made in order to receive him, while Mary merely sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. So when their brother Lazarus fell ill, and instead of getting better, got worse instead, they became desperate and sought the Lord. They knew that if there was anyone who could help him, it had to be him. So the sisters sent word to Jesus to ask him to come. And once again, upon hearing the message, gives us the most baffling answer. Jesus gives us the most baffling answer. In verse 4, he said, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." As if that was not enough, Jesus continued to stay where he was for 2 more days before finally deciding that it was time to leave. Strange. Now, in 2019, my third child, Rachel, had fever, high fever, and after battling it all night, she had a fit in the morning. As we were trying our best to help her, her eyes suddenly rolled back, and she went just blue and limp, and we panicked. I rushed her down to KKH A&E, and thank God that in the middle of the car ride, she regained consciousness. But she was still not yet fully out of the woods because her fever was still very high and was very worried that another fit might come at any time. So imagine if I reached KKH A&E only for the attending doctor to say, "Nah, she's all right. It's just a fit and she's back now, isn't she? Sorry, I have someone more urgent to attend to. Bye." I don't know what desperation would have made me turn into in that circumstance, but I'm very sure it wouldn't be pretty, especially since it involved a loved one. But that seemed to be what Jesus had totally done when not only did he dismiss the urgency of the matter, he took his time in going to the sisters. If Jesus truly loved the siblings, as verse 5 tells us, then this must have been the greatest contradiction, right? Well, verse 6 starts with "so," and that tells us that he stayed where he was for 2 more days because of his love for them. And in verses 7 and 8, we subsequently begin to see Jesus' love for them when he insisted on going through Judea, where his life was last threatened, just to reach the sisters. A long, long time ago, when I was still a little boy, my father wanted to buy durians at a store. Now it's durian season, right? And he tried it, he didn't like it, and he moved on. And so angry, the durian seller started threatening us with his chopper. He was waving it around. And of course, we went away as fast as we could. I remember looking back at the durian seller a few more times as he stood where he was, continuing to wave his chopper about and shouting at us. I clearly remember telling my father, "Please don't go back that way." Yet Jesus told his disciples to go back to Judea, exactly where he was last threatened with stoning. And Jesus' answer continues to be strange. After the disciples questioned the wisdom in doing so, his answer was, he talks about the number of hours in daylight, 12 to be exact, and states the obvious that those who walk in the day will not stumble because they can see by the light, but those who walk in the night will stumble because they have no light. Actually, from last week's sermon, we can understand what Jesus was really talking about. He was assuring his disciples that the hour of his betrayal, crucifixion, and death had not yet come. So he knew that nothing would happen to him in Judea. Walking in the will of his Father was the light that assured him of the next steps ahead. And you know what? His reply was actually meant to reveal that things happen according to divine appointment. That is God's timing. It was meant to set the stage for what was to come later in the story. That's why immediately in the next few verses, after telling his disciples that Lazarus had died, Jesus said in verse 15, he was glad that for their sake, he was not there with Lazarus earlier so that they may believe. Now, if I were Mary or Martha, I would totally hate the guts of these faithless disciples of Jesus, because by the time Jesus finally arrived, Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days, starting to decompose. You know, when Jesus arrived, the state of Lazarus showed the level of desperation and urgency of the sisters when they first called on him. However, he remained unfazed, waited for 2 more days, because he knew everything was happening just as it was meant to be, according to God's will. Jesus had a point to make, and at the same time, he is also a master at cultural sensitivity. And he knew that in those times, there was a popular belief amongst the Jews that the spirit of a deceased person hovered around the body for 3 days, trying to re-enter it repeatedly. Maybe not so different from Asian culture. And he only stopped doing so when he saw that the body had started the process of physical decomposition and no longer looked the same. Then the spirit would leave for good. Okay, I'm in no way implying that Jesus subscribed to that thinking, because he doesn't, okay? But because there was no process of a medical doctor declaring someone dead in first century Israel, there have been reports of heart fibrillation happening in people thought dead whilst they were being carried in a coffin to their burial place. And this resuscitation would result in the coffin bearers hearing the most dreaded sound of all. Toc, 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 toc. Tapping from the inside of the coffin from a body they thought was 2 days old. So if Jesus had gone to raise Lazarus from the dead before the popular Jewish belief of a deceased spirit hovering over his body for 3 days was over, those present who witnessed the miracle could have just dismissed it as a fluke, chance, coincidence, or at the very least labeled it non-miraculous because, proven, the spirit was already there anyway and it managed to re-enter. By waiting for 4 days with a body that had already started to stink, neither customs nor nature could try to hold a dead person back from being recognized as 100% dead. By waiting for 4 days, Jesus would later perform arguably the most important miracle with 100% certainty. The divine appointment revealed helps us to understand that things can happen in ways that we do not understand or like, but happen because they are exactly how God wants them to be. I have 4 kids, and they remind me every single day of something. How we always want our way now. And you know what? I've also come to realize that we don't really grow up from that petulant behavior. We just grow better at hiding it as adults. And if we are honest, most of the time, that's how we approach God too. Now, now, now. But as a good father, God makes divine appointments with us because he loves us, not because he wants to prolong our pain or make them worse or keep us waiting. But it's exactly because he loves us and knows exactly what we need at any particular moment. When we realize that, that's when we receive the revelation of his divine affection. And that's what he was about to reveal to the sisters. Point number 2, divine affection revealed. However, surely it cannot be said of Jesus that he had any divine affection for the siblings, since what he did was tantamount to, at least humanly, ignoring a desperate plea for help when he could have helped immediately, allowing the sick to become deceased and coming only after the deceased had been dead for 4 days, like an afterthought. Now, this is the kind of behavior that would end any relationship. Why did Jesus seemingly do all that? Let's continue reading from John chapter 11, verses 18 to 37. It says this, "Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. 'Lord,' Martha said to Jesus, 'if you had been there, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask.' And Jesus said to her, 'Your brother will rise again.' And Martha answered, 'I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day.' And Jesus said to her, 'I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die.' Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. She said, "The teacher is here and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. But when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, exact same words as Martha, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" The situation was obviously tense. Jesus had always been invited to their house. But this time, not only did Jesus not meet the sisters in their house, verse 30 tells us that he had not even entered the village. He stood at the periphery waiting to be let in. But he came as far as they would let him. Martha went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. I can imagine that Martha must have been thinking, "Wow, now he's here. He came when I cooked, but where was he when I cried?" So the first thing she said to him when she saw him was, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her frustration was understandable, but what she said next was truly astounding. She said, "But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." It is astounding because even in that moment of anguish and disappointment, she still had the faith in humility to recognize God as good. We'll see later in verse 39 that by this, she was not expecting Jesus to raise Lazarus, no, because she had not yet recognized the deity of the Lord Jesus. But She thought of Jesus as just another unusually great man, like the prophets of old. She was probably just asking for Jesus to ask God to bring comfort and good out of this tragedy because she knew God would always grant Jesus' requests. And Jesus then told her that her brother will rise again. And further showing that she was not expecting Jesus to raise her brother to life because she had not yet recognized the deity of Jesus, she answered him like any good Orthodox Jew would and said that she knows it will happen at the end of time as prophesied for all of God's people. It would happen someday, just not today. Then Jesus replied by saying that he is the resurrection and the life, and asked Martha if she believed that. It was as if Jesus was saying, no, Martha, you do not understand. He knew she had not really understood what he really meant, that he was literally life, and that he would raise Lazarus right now, that he could overcome death with his power, that it is impossible for death to prevail in his presence, that anyone who believes in Jesus, who is united with him in faith, is living eternally now as well as at the end. He was essentially revealing the truth of his deity to Martha in divine affection because he knew that was what Martha needed. A touch of truth to help her to continue to trust God in a moment of deep, deep pain. It was like something clicked in her. Not only did she realize that Jesus was not indifferent to the death of her dear brother Lazarus, he is in fact the Son of God, the Savior who has come into the world. And what love she must have felt at that moment to know that she was standing in the presence of the Messiah himself, that he would enter into her moment of pain personally to assure her that everything was going to be all right, that he would personally assure her that death does not have the last word. He does. What divine affection revealed to Martha, the straight-talking sister, who was given these words of life. You know, aha moments of revelation always prompt us into action. And so, Martha ran all the way back home to get her sister Mary. And she told her that Jesus was waiting for her. The teacher had come. Come, Mary. And so Mary quickly got up and went to Jesus, who was still standing at the village gate waiting. And all the Jews who had been with her in the house went with her. When Mary saw Jesus, she must have been overcome with heartbreaking grief, and she fell at his feet and said the exact same words as Martha did moments earlier. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Exact same words, but I would imagine expressed in a vastly different manner. You know, Mary, in tandem with first century Jewish customs, must have been wailing in sorrow as she grieved for her brother in her house. It was such that friends and families would demonstrate their comforting of the grieving family by joining in the sorrow and wailing. And that's why so many people were in Martha's and Mary's house. And when Mary bolted out of the house, they quickly followed, all these Jews, right? Thinking that they would continue grieving with her at the tomb. They didn't know that they would soon become witnesses to a great demonstration of God's comforting power. So, when Jesus sees this heartbroken Mary sobbing once again and wailing at his feet in so much pain, along with the Jews who had been with her, it made him greatly troubled. But Jesus was not angry or disturbed with the sisters or those who were there with them, or even himself for not coming earlier to prevent all this. Rather, he was deeply troubled and outraged by the sadness and suffering death causes, and he was very troubled to see that this is the outcome of man's sin, that it would create such an ugly enemy in death, and that caused him great inward grief. In fact, Bible scholars commented that deeply moved and troubled, as the verse tells us, do not carry the severity of Jesus' feelings towards death. According to the original Greek, the word used was closer to something like bellowing with rage. Then he asked them to show him where Jesus' tomb was. They brought him to it, and Jesus wept. And most of the Jews who were there with them concluded Jesus' tears must have been because he loved Lazarus deeply. Yet, there was a small group present who cast doubt on both his love for Lazarus and his ability to do anything about it. Before all this, Jesus had been standing at the gate of the village, right? But all he had desired was just to enter in. So when Mary and the Jews finally motioned him to come in and see where Lazarus had been laid, he wept as he entered into their pain and trauma. Our pain pains him. Our grief grieves him. Honestly, he could have simply bypassed this whole Martha and Mary encounter, or these two encounters with the sisters, and simply jump straight to the point, the part of the story where he raises Lazarus to life. But he chose to meet them first because of his perfect love for us. He chose to reveal his divine affection for us as he enters into our world. And he does so because he wants us to be awakened to his deity, that we may believe in him. That the doubt cast by the small group could be decisively dealt with. And what better way to do it than to answer the question of whether he could really raise Jesus from the dead? And so, third point is this: divine awakening revealed. As we are now reaching the climatic finale to this story, the most important question remains unanswered. Can this Jesus person actually overcome an enemy as formidable as death? One that has a 100% unbroken, proven track record. Sure, he turned water to wine at a wedding, and it's impressive, but that must seem like a parlor trick compared to raising the dead to life at a funeral. Let's finish up the story from John chapter 11, verses 38 to 46. It says this: Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. Remember, this deeply moved. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, saying, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and who had seen what Jesus had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. As Jesus arrived at the tomb, remember he wept just before that, right? I can imagine that he wiped away his tears as the resurrection and the life, and he was readying himself to face his enemy, death. As he came face to face with the tomb where Lazarus lay, Jesus was filled with the same outrage that he had felt when he saw the heartbrokenness of Mary and the Jews who were with her. Again, not at her, not at them, not at himself, but at the sadness and suffering his enemy death had inflicted on his beloved people. This is like a scene right of any epic movie, where the chief hero faces the chief villain in a final showdown. It's a battle for supremacy where only one can emerge victorious. And Jesus makes the first move and demands for the stone to be removed. The first barrier to believing in him was in the process of being removed. But Martha tried to intervene because removing the stone would reveal a stench so bad, as Lazarus had been there for 4 days. However, it was necessary to prove beyond any any, not just reasonable, but any doubt that Lazarus' death was reality. No Jewish superstition of the spirit hovering over for 3 days over the body could provide an alternative narrative for what was about to happen. In the process, Jesus was also removing the hearts of stone of the people who were witnessing everything. But, he seemed to be really exasperated with Martha's intervention. Imagine if you were Martha. Jesus had just told you that your dead brother would rise again if you believed. And as in verse 4 says, he assures that this illness would not end in death. And then he goes with you to your brother's tomb, right? And he starts doing things to prove his words. Now, if I were Martha, I would be waiting with bated breath for the outcome, not stop here and say, no, Jesus, don't do that. Not Martha. Then Jesus reminded her about their conversation where he had told her if she believed, she would see the glory of God. Remember last week I admitted that when it came to miracles, it used to be seeing is believing for me. Perhaps it's really so humanly counterintuitive to believe first, then see, that Martha could not wrap her head around this whole idea. That's why it is said in Hebrews 11:6 that without faith, it is impossible to please God because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. The believing must come before the seeing. In addressing Martha directly, he had in fact also addressed what must have been secretly on the hearts of the rest of the witnessing Jews who were present as well. And now, he had awakened expectation and encouraged faith. The people were fully expecting Jesus to do exactly as he says he could and he would. So without saying another word, you realize there was no collection of what they said. They took away the stone. Wow, the stench that followed must have put a whole wave of doubt back into their hearts. But Jesus immediately looked to heaven and prayed to his Father. He wanted them to know that what he was about to do was possible, only because he was doing what the Father had sent him to do. And that would truly mean that he is the resurrection and the life, because God can only do that. Then Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And just as God spoke life into being at the beginning of creation in Genesis 1, the dead man came out, still wrapped in grave clothes, at the mere command of God's voice. Some Bible scholars have joked that if Jesus had not called Lazarus out by name, then tombs all over would be busy spitting out their dead. Such is the power of God. Now, if this was really an epic showdown between the chief hero and the chief villain, there would really be no contest to begin with. The power play was so lopsided that death really stood no chance at all, even just at the sound of God's voice. Death, however formidable an enemy it seemed, with that 100% unbroken track record, could not deny life. From time to time, I would dream about feeling super underprepared for an examination and fail in the worst possible way. The guilt, the dread, the shame I would feel were hauntingly terrible and worst of all, real. Then I would wake up and feel such a wonderful sense of relief, like, whew, that it was all just a dream. That the reality I thought I had been in was completely undone, that it had come untrue. When Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, that was exactly what was done. Everything bad, everything broken, everything dead had come untrue. Instead of meeting Lazarus at the bedside, Jesus met him at the tomb so that people would believe and then see the glory of God's power manifested in the strongest way possible. That is, bringing the dead back to life. In fact, that was all that mattered, because John does not even record the reactions or the words of post-raised Lazarus. It was secondary. Like what I mentioned last week, we must not get caught up in the miracle itself that we miss the true miracle, the revelation of Jesus Christ as God and Savior in the flesh, so that we may believe in Him. And this divine revelation, and this revelation caused a divine awakening in the people who witnessed this miracle. They were confronted with the uncomfortably unorthodox possibility that Jesus is really God, the resurrection and the life. After seeing Lazarus walk out from the tomb alive at the mere sound of his voice. And many of the Jews chose to believe in him. However, there were some who went off to tell the Jewish religious leaders what Jesus had done. They had also made a decision on Jesus, but it was a decision to not believe in him. Raising the dead to life was the most contentious and final miracle Jesus would get to do whilst on earth, because after that, the religious leaders plotted to get Jesus killed, and eventually they succeeded by getting him crucified on the cross. Jesus entered into their lives then and still into ours today, just to do that for us, to bring the promise of undoing all the bad that has ever happened to you on the last day by pointing to himself as the resurrection and the life. And Jesus now promises that on the last day, there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. He will make everything new. And let's read this from Revelation 21 verses 3 to 5. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." In a letter to PM Lee from the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's friend, he revealed that at the start of 2015, Mr. Lee and his friends would go for gatherings. And at each of these gatherings, it had become a tradition to ask Mr. Lee if there will be a Singapore many years from now. Once Mr. Lee said, "Maybe." On another occasion, Mr. Lee said, "Yes, if there is no corruption." Finally, in the spirit of SG 50 in 2015, they asked Mr. Lee if there will be a Singapore 50 years from now, to which Mr. Lee said for the first time, "Of course, there will be, even better." And you know what? Not just for 50 years, but from the end of time to all eternity, God promises to make everything new. He promises to make things even better, as the old order of things will pass away at the end of time. And he entered his tomb to empty our tombs by going to the cross and giving up his life. He defeated death once and for all. The debt of sin had been fully paid. So yes, that better is achieved, as there will be no more corruption from sin. Hence, there will be no more death, mourning, crying, or pain. He will wipe away every tear from our eyes. What a wonderfully comforting promise that brings great assurance in the midst of a world of death, hurt, and pain. And this promise is available to all of us today if we believe in Jesus. And today, as we look forward as a nation to emerging stronger together with our Singapore spirit, may the Spirit of God grant you a divine awakening to choose to believe in him, so that no matter how depressing your situation may be or can get, you can see how he turns mourning into dancing and tears into joy. May that also be the journey of our nation as we continue to recover from the pandemic.